I still get a lot of 19-year-olds that are just like, fresh out of high school. So I do think that maybe there is something that people have argued for a gap year. Let them explore the world before going back to school. Because I think the students that I have that have done other things in their lives, they do come with a richer experience. Yeah, so I actually do want to say something too eventually of how I see the undergraduate population today. But let me kind of just today give you kind of a sketch of my intellectual journey, my how I arrived where I'm at now, and some of the major theological and spiritual questions and issues that I've been grappling with in my scholarship and in my teaching. As Karen mentioned, I am a native Tucsonian, and actually my family history goes back quite a while, and at least in the late 1800s in the southern Arizona area. Both sides of my family, the Nava and Vasquez and my mother's side. But I didn't necessarily grow up, I am the first graduate in college, so I didn't necessarily grow up surrounded by books. And I don't know what it was, but in college, there was definitely an expectation that I was going to go to college. And I stumbled my way into a couple of classes in my undergraduate, I think at the U of A here. One was taught by a remarkable Dominican priest, Robert Burns, Father Burns. He was very well known in the Tucson community and did a lot of ecumenical lectures around town, different churches, and he really kind of lit a fire in me. I stumbled into his class. I was a pre-med major, so I was thinking of, my major was microbiology, and I ended up getting my degree in microbiology, but I decided to add a minor in religious studies and philosophy, mainly because of Dr. Burns. It was one of those shock of recognition experiences where this is something that's profound and insightful, and I love the way the big questions that the religions were asking, why we're here, and about orientation of purpose, a meaning-driven life, and the values that you adopt and you live your life by. All of these kinds of big questions, the question of suffering, the question of mortality, of death and dying, and all of these questions were really remarkable, and I just kind of did a 180. And I also had this remarkable Reformation scholar named Heiko Obermann, to know the name. Heiko Obermann was the greatest scholar of the Reformation. He happened to be at the University of Arizona, mainly because he was tenured at Harvard in his 30s when he was tenured at Harvard, and he left Harvard to Tübingen in Germany. When he came to lecture one time in Tucson, and his wife came with them, and she had bad arthritis, and she was off of medications, and so they made him offer, and he came here for the desert climate. And so, but he was also a remarkable thinker. Again, that period of Reformation, the Renaissance, was also very deeply influential, and so they were both remarkable. In fact, I remember Heiko Obermann was the greatest scholar of the Reformation. I remember Bob Bird, you probably heard this story, but he introduced Professor Obermann one time as perhaps the greatest Reformation scholar alive. And Professor Obermann was Dutch, and his English was good, but slightly broken. And he got up and he said, "My English has improved a lot, but what is this word perhaps?" So, it's not in confidence at all, but he was a remarkable person, generous too, and had a big influence on me. So mainly because of those two influences, I decided that I wanted to pursue religion and decided against the kind of the pre-med path. And yeah, I applied to various graduate schools, and the people at the University of Chicago at the time were really remarkable. I considered staying here with Michael Obermann, but Dr. Burns told me it's like, with Michael Obermann here, yes, but at Chicago you're going to have many Obermanns, and so it really was true. It was a wonderful place, and a couple of scholars particularly influenced me. I have a theologian named David Tracy, very philosophical theologian, but remarkable for some of the reasons I want to talk about. But also Bernard McGinn. Bernard McGinn is one of the great scholars of medieval mysticism. If you want to read anything on the Christian mystical tradition, Bernard McGinn is a good resource. But I think what I found particularly compelling about the work of David Tracy is he used this term mystical prophetic. And something about that because it's been a very strong influence in my scholarship and throughout the works that I've written and articles. He always pointed out that he was very interested in the hyphen that connects the mystical and the prophetic together, the hyphen that connects us. Because a lot of times in various Christian traditions and even other religions, they're often estranged from each other. So that people that are drawn to the mystical and the spiritual, in some cases, can kind of neglect the aspect of prophetic elements, the questions of justice. So I love the idea of like connecting, and to put it for a very preliminary basic sketch of each, if you think about the notion of the mystic was somebody kind of searching for a direct contact with the divine, a direct experience of the divine, something immediate. And the mystics often employed various ceremonies, liturgies, the experience of beauty of nature, beauty of human artistic creation as a means by which one can ascend to God. So there's actually a very strong aesthetical dimension in many of the mystics. Communion of God through the beauty of God's creation. And in fact, the period of like ecological crisis that we're facing, a lot of people found the mystics had a very, very rich resource for thinking about God's presence in the world around us, presence in, as St. Francis said, the sun, brother sun, the moon, the stars, animal life, the earth. But the criticism of the mystics, I think sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's, I think, misconceived, but is that they can be escapists. And that is sometimes a fair criticism, that they're kind of neglecting what's happening in history around them. And it could be that people that are drawn to the natural world sometimes can kind of neglect what's happening in history and the communities around them. So I thought it was fascinating. If you think about the notion of the prophet, on the other hand, there's a very strong concern with historical events and the world around them. Most of the biblical prophets situate themselves in certain contexts, like the Assyrian conquest of Israel or the Babylonian exile. So there's a great awareness of what's happening in the world around them. And these prophets are spokespeople, like spokesmen and women speaking on behalf of God. But particularly, there's a concern among the prophets for the poor, for the widows, for the orphans, for the strangers in our midst. And of course, Jesus, very much in that tradition, very, very strongly, like he's channeling the classic prophets, Isaiah, Hosea, Jeremiah, Micah. He's channeling them, speaking on behalf of being a voice of the disenfranchised, the voice of the powerless, the poor and the needy. So I think it is fair to like generalize that the mystic and the prophet have different sensibilities in many ways, but they're both part of the biblical and they're both part of the Christian tradition. And I think it's important to integrate those two together. And that was, again, what was particularly compelling about the work of David Tracy. He kind of led me to one of the great, most influential, I would say, theologians of the late 20th century, was a Peruvian theologian named Gustavo Gutierrez. And Gustavo Gutierrez is the founder of a movement called liberation theology. And in many ways, the movement of liberation theology arose, the concept of liberation was very, very common in the 1960s. So in the 1960s and 70s, he was kind of drawing on aspects of the zeitgeist of the times. But there was, decolonial movements in third world countries, struggling for independence. So the concept of liberation had that flavor to it. But Gustavo Gutierrez is still alive. He's 94 and still in good health. He's living in Lima. And he is a Catholic priest. And he was, what kind of remarkable about him is liberation theology, he's considered like the father of this movement, was often criticized for being Marxist. And he was always, he says, dumbfounded by that idea, because it is true that there was aspects of the Marxian tradition, the criticisms of the excesses of capitalism, especially capitalism in Latin America, which has a very atrocious record in Latin America, like the rich controlling all of the wealth and resources, the vast majority of people suffering and being exploited. But he always says, so he, I love this remark that often mentioned. He said that, in fact, he got his PhD in France. And he said that a part of his thesis, his doctoral thesis, was on Freud. And he says, nobody ever thinks of calling me a Freudian, because I address a few aspects of Marx. I'm a Marxist, and it just kind of goes to show you at the time it was about labels, like if you had any kind of concern for the plight of the poor, you automatically associated with the part of communism. But the fact of the matter is, Gustavo Gutierrez and most of the liberation theologians were deeply grounded in the biblical theology. Their theology was based on, basically, it was a reincarnation of the gods. I mean, really, one of the most important figures to Gustavo Gutierrez was the Dominican also in the 16th century named Las Casas, Bartolome de las Casas, the Dominican who was known as the defender of the Indians. So during the period of the Spanish conquest, he was really denouncing what was happening in the world around him. Talk about like speaking on behalf of the abused, speaking on behalf of the afflicted. There's one remarkable line that always stands out to me about Las Casas. He says, "In the face of the afflicted Indians of the Americas, Jesus Christ is beaten, scourged, and crucified, not once, but thousands. The idea that see God and Christ in the face of the other, who were non-Christians. And so he was outraged by what was happening. It's that spirit that's kind of reborn in the movement of liberation. And again, I think somebody like Gustavo Gutierrez, for him, it was all grounded in the biblical and the theological traditions. For him, it wasn't about Marx. It was about being true to the biblical sensibility, the biblical vision, especially of God's identification, God's solidarity with the outcasts and the oppressed, that runs throughout the entire biblical tradition. So, of course, one of the most important narratives in liberation theology is the story of Exodus. Of course, God identifies with the plight of the slaves, not the Pharaoh. God is on the side of the enslaved Israelites and sends them a figure in Moses to liberate them, to lead them out of bondage. And of course, that narrative is profoundly important in Black history and throughout the Americas, certainly in North American history. Very, very crucial narrative. So, of course, Exodus was very important for Gustavo Gutierrez, as was obviously all of the biblical prophets, passages in Deuteronomy, like love the stranger, for you two were once strangers in the land of Egypt. I mean, all of these, that sensibility, of course, leading up to the stories of the biblical narratives, where there seems to be quite clearly option, like the term that liberation used that made people slightly uncomfortable is this preferential option. And some people objected to that doesn't God love us all? We have to be poor and disenfranchised. I think that was never the intent. That was never the message that God's love is exclusive or something. But that in the biblical tradition, it's the poor and those that are powerless in many ways that God identifies, and that the concept of justice in the biblical tradition is renouncing of power by those that have resources in the interest of those that are in need, that are powerless. Renounce part of that power for the sake of others, for the good of the poor and the needy. And of course, again, that runs throughout the New Testament, especially in Luke's gospel, where it's very critical of, like, time and time again, there's so many passages of criticism of the refusal to share one's resources. I have a needle. But numerous passages of that sort. The guy in Luke's gospel who builds a barn and he has so much excess resources that he doesn't think about sharing it, thinks instead of building another barn. There's like countless episodes throughout the New Testament where there is this real, like, strong identification on the part of Jesus before the outcast. That's all the message of liberation theology was. But what compelled me about and drew me to Gustavo Gutierrez is it was always also connected to a spirituality and to a very strong sense of a life of prayer, a life of searching for God. It was never just about like justice and human rights alone, disconnected from a life of meditation, a life of spirituality, of religiosity. And so, again, it was like he was fascinated with how to combine the mystic of that moment of connection, of the hyphen in between. And again, it's a kind of basic message of liberation theology. Gustav Geddes called it, he didn't call it the mystical prophetic like David Tracy did. He often referred to it as the mystical political, but for him, it was kind of like it was drawing on the prophetic tradition. And so I wrote my dissertation and my first book on that concept of mystical and prophetic of Gustavo Geddes. And in many ways that the key element of connecting those two, of binding them together, has been a part of my scholarship and part of my teaching. I guess what has been an unexpected part when I arrived at the University of Arizona, this was like an unexpected development in my teaching research. I noted that there were classes on jazz, there were classes on history of reading, there were classes, of course, on like classical music, European composers. But nobody is paying attention to this movement called hip hop. And I thought it's a huge mission. And I think that there's a complexity that often is lost on people that just have a very like superficial like understanding of hip hop, because hip hop, of course, is one of those genres of music that has like problematic extremes. Like there's extraordinary artistry, and then there could be an incredibly like vulgar and trouble. So there's both, and it's like, what do you do with that? Like, you know, there's a tremendous richness, and there's things that are alarming. But so are a lot of things in life. Ambiguity. There's ambiguity in so many things. And sad to say, like even in the Christian tradition, I wish it wasn't the case, but there's profound ambiguity in the Christian tradition. The history of the Crusades and the way in which Christianity has played a part in the white supremacy in North America, or you know, played a part in sexism and you know and continues. And so the Christianity itself is profoundly ambiguous. And of course, the biblical heritage has been used in good and bad. Biblical heritage has been used to justify slavery. The biblical heritage has been used to justify conquest and colonialism, that we're going to conquer these native peoples. A lot of times would be like both biblical texts of taking the land, Israelites walking into the land of Canaan and killing the inhabitants of those lands. So there is that kind of ambiguity, but if so what was kind of unexpected is this, like, I never thought hip hop would consume my kind of mind and imagination like I just did. And I started learning more and more about it. I grew up actually listening to it. My brother was a great dancer. And so it was, I definitely was very aware of it, but it was kind of like a private pleasure. Never saw it connecting. Like a place like the University of Chicago, it was the peripheral marginal, not only marginal, but non-existent in the youth of the academy. But here's what I began to notice, like already in graduate school in the 1990s, is that in many ways, the classes were extraordinary, intellectually challenging and rich. But for example, I remember having a class in like social theory, and where we were reading like Durkheim and Weber and you know all these great social theorists. And I remember thinking, on the other hand, like reading the newspaper about problems that was happening on the south side of Chicago. that the university was completely oblivious to. And here we are, University of Chicago, this like elitist university right on the south side of Chicago. And yet it was kind of like they described it as like an island of privilege, you know, in a sea of around. And the injustice and the inequality so glaring, and yet this class on social theory never thought that that would be a relevant conversation to have. And so what I'm saying is that I began to realize, wow, actually hip hop is addressing issues that's happening in the world around us in a more honest and creative way than even some of my great at the university. And I thought in other ways, I think this is true of all academic life. And my article, actually, you can find it on Commonweal is magazine, but it was just published in the April edition, the one that went into the newsletter. But it's about my experience in Casa Lucas, which I want to talk about. But what I said in many ways is that universities really are like gardens. They really are. And but it's like, it almost feels like a garden to me. And so University of Chicago, like a garden. I mean, it's extraordinary, like beautiful, the architecture, you feel like you're a wizard, like Harry Potter. But even the university, even at the University of Arizona, it's like they're beautiful places and the life of the mind. Like I definitely believe that the unexamined life is not worth living. That motto of Socrates, and that the intellectual life is about these inquiries, about questioning, about seeking, the search. And I love all of that. And I pursue all of these questions with my students. But it sometimes can feel totally like isolated from the world around. And it's almost like I'm beginning to think of the notion of the desert as kind of like the Garden of Eden. But we live our lives in exile. We live our lives in the desert, not in the garden. And I think the search for wisdom always has to like leave and enter into the exile, enter into the migration through the desert, accompany that are in those struggles. And so I think in many ways, it surprised me about hip hop is like there's many different aspects of it. So to primer in hip hop, it typically refers to 4 different elements. One is the art of the music making, the beat making, which is extraordinarily creative and more complex than it employs this idea of sampling, where you're taking bits and pieces, fragments of older pieces of music, and you're recombining them in new ways. And what people don't often realize is the extraordinary artistry of some of these producers, taking bits and pieces of Sam Cooke, adding a piano line from classical music, combine it with like strong bass beats, and there's creativity in the music making. So that was one aspect of the music making. The second element is the dancing, particularly the break dancing, the graffiti art, and the art of MCing, the rap. And in many ways, I guess what stood out to me as I dived deeper into when I created it, so I created this class, Rap Culture and God, and it really took off. And I think I really saw it as a way of like talking about religious issues through something that students would respond to. But it became more, that kind of can be in many ways, it'd be like disparaging towards hip hop, like, oh, we're just gonna talk about these issues and I'm just gonna, hip hop is just a means, but I started realizing how extraordinary and the poetry of some of these rappers, some of it, again, I repeat, is vulgar and awful and sexist and disturbing in many ways. But you just dismiss it like that, it's, you don't know the complexity of it. There's so many talented artists that were speaking about their lives on the edges of American life. And they were addressing issues in the 1980s and 90s that now is very much like in mainstream media, but they were speaking about like the unfairness of, you know, the legal system to many young Black kids in urban environments, caught with possession of marijuana. They were addressing issues of like the explosion of incarceration in the 1980s and 90s, where the rates of incarceration for Black and brown kids really exploded. They were addressing issues of police violence, that targeting of their community. So there was just like so many things that in many ways they were like speaking on behalf of the voice, the disenfranchised. And I thought that in many ways, the University of Chicago needs to do this, and they often did it. And so I still feel that way, that I think universities in general can, like I said, often kind of neglect what's happening in the world around them. At the University of Arizona, I think we're fortunate that there's a lot of wonderful communities at the university that are very engaged in the world around them, that want to leave like the garden environments of the university and like stand in solidarity with others. And I think Casalitas has been that for me. There's other, you know, communities on campus that are very engaged in different aspects of Tucson life. But Casalitas has meant a lot to me, and I guess that was the basic thrust of this very short article for Commonweal, and I think they called it like there's no room. If you look it up under no room at the inn, you find it under my name, like Commonweal. But it's a very short article about, I think it's been an education for me that I get all of these like big questions that I love discussing with my students, but in many ways, the experience of Casalitas like takes me out of that world, that garden-like distance, and puts me like uproots me, and gives me face-to-face contact with people that have absolutely nothing. It's remarkable. In fact, I was telling my I have a niece and nephew that both graduated from college at UA. This and I was telling them just yesterday that I was at the airport yesterday, and about this young and indigenous family that I was helping at the airport. So the asylum seekers that Casalitas receives, and Karen is right, it was a small house before it moved to the convent country club. Now it's an apartment complex, but that's another conversation. But now we found new facilities off of Tahoe, and now they have yet another larger facility. And so it's explosive growth as well. That's a weakness, but they will come to the border and they're processed through ICE and border control. Before the Title 42 went away, the border control and ICE had almost like indiscriminate and kind of arbitrary like their power. to decide who's gonna cross. They decide because of Title 42 won't be able to. So we never really knew, but we've received people from Russia, from India, from Georgia, from like the Dominican Republic, Haiti, a lot of Haiti. The interesting thing about the Haitians, a lot of them left Haiti after the big flood several years ago and went to live in Chile. And a lot of them work, so we actually communicate with them in Spanish. Most of them are Spanish speaking, that they've lived there for 4 or 5 years. But now that the situation is deteriorating, experiences periods of drought throughout Latin America, things that even the biblical patriarchs had to do. You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They all had to migrate because of, remember, famine in the land. They migrated to Egypt. The reality of migration is ancient. It's going to continue. There's nothing that's going to change the human history. People will migrate to where there's opportunity and resources. But I was telling my family about this indigenous family from Ecuador, a mother, and truly the cutest, like 4 daughters. And one was 2-year-old, the other one was 3. It was funny because they like literally went in order like that. Horrible. And there was 4 of them, and my sister-in-law asked a question that only a mother, like I wasn't, to be honest, I wasn't thinking of this. And she's just like, I couldn't imagine in a language. They came from Ecuador with 4 children. And you're asking, like, what do they do about what did they do about diapers? What did they do about eating? Like, and she was asking all these questions that I wasn't like thinking about from a mother's perspective. And she was like, I couldn't imagine doing that journey on a plane, with all the resources. And she said when their kids would carry huge diaper bags with like multiple. But yeah, I mean, and we've had a lot of the ones coming from South America go through the fairness. If you've ever heard of the Darien Dam, it's like a harrowing 3-day journey through the jungle where you're dealing with snakes, and if you fracture a leg, there's no humanitarian help during that journey. So it's a harrowing journey. Sometimes again, buses, train, the famous train they call the beast. Desperate, if you're really desperate and don't have any resources, jump on these trains. But so it's remarkable. So I guess the gist of the article was like it's really been educational for me, like and also gives me the kind of peace and serenity that comes from a life of like service. I can't imagine and I have that experience of fulfillment in my teaching, but it is still very different. Like the college students, in many ways, even the first generation students, I mean, to some extent, made it a long way. They've come along. But it's really remarkable and humbling, and you appreciate things that you otherwise take for granted of how much we have in American life when you have these people that are filled with hope. And the kids were like laughing and smiling, and she was like, "Well, I'm thinking, like the things that we complain about." She had 0 money, so we're like trying to connect her with her sponsors, but can't do flights. So typically, the sponsors will pay for their airline tickets if they can. This is not something that Casalitas likes, doesn't want to advertise. There's no way you can help everybody, but if they're there for more than 3 or 4 days and have no other, there's money that comes in that we help Lush Fund with their journey to their sponsors where they can later apply for asylum. Hopefully, we see a lawyer, you can't do that. So it's really been remarkable, and I think that we've had again people from a lot recently from India, the Dominican Republic, again parts of Guatemala, Nicaragua, and a lot of times indigenous speakers where that have like very like Spanish. Sometimes they're just native speakers. So it's been a beautiful experience, and so far people have asked that like have you seen this explosion of need with Title 42 going away. I think part of it was like this language of crisis, which also this hysteria about like invasion and this and that. These are like even crisis, super loaded terms, and it's like ultimately there are ebbs and flows in migration, and we're dealing with post-pandemic. There was periods of all these countries going through severe crises, and failures of government, of droughts, of periods where the people who would otherwise want to stay in their countries, no choice to pick up and leave. But again, you read the biblical tradition with an eye to the idea of migration. Exile is so much part of their heritage, including like the story of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in Matthew's gospel, where they're forced to go to Egypt. Kind of echoes the experience of the biblical patriarchs. But that idea of like fleeing persecution is a gang violence, or the threats of criminality and threats of death. Part of human history. It's a reality that we're facing in our world today, not just our border, but obviously throughout Europe and throughout most of the developed world. So I guess in conclusion, just like now 45 minutes, that I think that I came to the University of Arizona with this notion of like, again, wanting to convey of like the both spiritual dimensions of the study of religion, that these questions have spiritual value for these young men and women. The other thing that has been most pronounced among undergraduates today is the experiences of anxiety and depression. That all-time highs. I've never had so many students write emails to me telling me that they've been hospitalized or are getting treatment for anxiety and depression. 18 to 22. Like, I remember that as a time of like excitement, and you're like having fun with friends, and yet more was experiencing anxiety and depression. And I think it's a loss. In many ways, the study of religion can go in a super intellectual, theoretical direction. And sometimes it can lose sight of what I think the essence of it is, these tackling some of these great existential issues. Again, the questions of your identity and what you're going to, the values you're going to adopt and live your life by. the question of how do I reflect what justice and beauty and love and what all of these mean, and students are starving. They really, really are. It is true that we live in a, I often tell my students, just to kind of go be countercultural, because they're often very much in the camp of like, I'm spiritual, not. So I typically say I'm religious, not spiritual. Because I think what that typically means is that I don't want to be connected. And yet they're so low. And yet they're still telling me that they don't want to be, have the pressure of being part of it. I think that's part of the beauty of what is being lost in American life in general, that loss of community. And so that is the generation that I'm kind of speaking to. But from my perspective, again, I sense a tremendous hunger for these questions, more than I ever had. Like more than I ever had, that they're almost more receptive to wrestling with like what God might mean for their lives. More than ever, because of some of the experiences of like psychological and spiritual crisis that many of them are dealing with. I'd stop there and give you some. I know you have great.
You started with the idea that everybody here has great hair, and you ended with students
Yeah.
that are coming to you that are in the 17 to 18
Yeah.
that are in crisis.
Yeah.
And we don't see any of them in the churches.
Yeah.
So how do you structure, how would you structure something to serve the need that you've identified without helping them to in churches we do that?
That's a great. Because in many ways, I was kind of responding to that issue with creating a class like on hip hop and religion. That was my initial inspiration, was that this is something that I know that many of them are listening to, are deeply passionate about, and has great creativity to talk about issues about race, class, gender, poetry. Like I forgot, I didn't mention that. Again, I could spend an entire semester talking about the complexity of the rhyming techniques of different rappers, the rhetorical and the gifts of oratory of so many of these rappers, the musical elements. There's just so much richness to talk about this. But can't do it in the confines of a classroom, because again, when I have 300 students, which I still do in this class, I guess I try to create somewhat of a community there. But once they leave those walls, like, I might urge them to rethink their assumptions. I think that's part of my job, is like to get them to question this, like just what I ended the class with, this to question this, I'm spiritual, not religious. And basically what it means is like I pick and choose what I want to hear from the biblical message, and I don't want to be challenged. Because then it's judgment, and religion shouldn't be judgmental. I get that. Like nobody wants a judgmental, but to be unsettled, be challenged, provoked is part of growth. Like in learning, how can you learn without being like challenged? But the question is like, so I guess the question is have them wrestle with that issue and maybe reconsider, like maybe in their own lives, if they're Jewish, to get reconnected to you. That's I think my hope is that, don't take for granted that there's a richness to Christianity. Like you think like it's not what you're necessarily told. It's not how the media necessarily portrays Christianity, and it's not, for example, like again, many come with the idea that it's like anti-science, anti-intellectual. Introduce them to like rich ideas that are not simplistic, are nuanced and thoughtful.
Okay, I'll take that as one step. Yeah. You wake up tomorrow and you're no longer a professor.
Yeah.
Over a much quality from it.
An emperor? Is that what it said?
I don't think I want that kind of.
No, it
Yeah,
hurts society
you know,
a lot.
It's, again, I know this is like, up to you earn it, like, I don't know, we constitute like communities, having these spaces.
Right.
You guys are there, like, I mean, this is like, and maybe it is that I'm speaking to an age where they're rebelling and don't want to be necessarily part of it. So maybe later in life, they'll reconnect. And there are those like studies sociologically of like periods of disengagement. And then eventually, you know, having kids and then, okay, rethinking, what am I gonna teach my kids and getting back involved. So you have. So, yeah.
Yeah. First, I just had this image, by the way, of, you know, there's these campus ministries, often more fundamentalist, you know, that go to hell, turn or burn. Now this picture somewhere on campus, a bunch of you in sock chairs with hard candy saying grandparents for spirituality. But share with me, I'll share my story, but I also want to hear some point, was a biology major pre-med and now a pastor, so that's kind of interesting. I want to hear the story. But I'm wondering, for you, you mentioned there's lots of ways as a professor of the campus to get connected and involved. What called you to Casa Elitis in particular? How did that intersect with your own spirituality story?
Yeah, I mean, so because of my interest in liberation theology, I was aware of the rich history that Tucson has. It's one of the things that Tucson can pride itself on, the history of the sanctuary movement and the way in which churches and synagogues and together in, you know, the 1980s to stand up for shelter, fleeing persecution and wanting to apply for asylum. So part of it was memory of that tradition. I also was very aware of, again, the way in which now Casa Elitis is kind of represented of the imagining of the reincarnation of the sanctuary movement in different ways. I mean, the initial sanctuary was a lot more dangerous. What they were doing, more and more doing is not legally questionable. But I met, you know, the name Dora Rodriguez. She is it's a remarkable story. She so she runs a shelter. If ever you want to give to a wonderful Casa Elitis would be wonderful too, but Casa, it's called Casa Esperanza, and it's on the Sasabe, Mexico side. But her story is truly remarkable. You can find it on YouTube clips of her Dora. And she was one of 1980. She was one of the, like, her story, the inspirations of the century. So she was a child, 1980, with her parents, and she was among 13 that died. With her, the Border Patrol says that she was 2 to 3 hours away from death when they found her. You can imagine the parched lips, burned skin, and this was in 1980. She was one of the first people that the sanctuary movement took in. So she was kind of her experience, part of the stimulus of the sanctuary movement. I have a friend of mine that teaches at Fordham. He's writing a book on sanctuary. He spent a lot of time. He's going to tell this story with Dora. And so she's at Casa Esperanza in Sasha Mesa, and they have a super modest house. They don't have the funding of Casa Elitis because Casa Elitis has been getting funding from federal board, from federal government, as well as it's an offshoot of Catholic Community Services. So they get some. But so I guess the reconnection was knowing that it's part of Tucson history, wanting to kind of seen it in many ways as kind of, the new sanctuary movement, and knowing that the biblical mandates of everything that I mentioned, welcoming the stranger. Obviously, Matthew 25 is the famous passage of Jesus. I was hungry again, I'm thirsty, you will drink. Was a stranger you welcome. All of these things feeding into, longing to, and like I said, believing that living like being Christian is even a theologian, is more than just life of speculation. There's actually a famous line that Martin Luther said, there's more to life, or more to a theologian. Thinking and speculating, but living. And he is like faith manifested.
Yeah, I'm wondering from your inspiration and how you're talking, are you leading some of those students into the community and into Casa Alitas who's begging for volunteers? Really, I think you're so inspiring that, I can see the Pied Piper.
Well, there already is a lot of, we are working on connections, with the university now. In fact, actually, we just won a very modest grant. Myself and one other faculty member applied for a grant to work on developing a connection more between Casa Alitas and the university. Or just literally.
Tell them to come here, we'll work with them. We worked with Casa Alitas about 7 years, we'd love to have them join us.
I will definitely let you know, because there's going to be a public event before it. It's going to be also like, we're going to have some kind of a public event. So that would be fantastic.
I was wondering if Americans could ask universal health care, whether that might help all Americans feel part of the community.
It's a diary. What is alarming is when you see these like on online searches for like people asking for money in massive debt or basic health care. It's really striking that in one powerful country that you have people that are struggling with medical debt, very hard to say, but yeah, I mean, how it can build.
Yes. I wonder in terms of maybe liberation theology and different cultural views of religion, are you familiar with the indigenous people's translation of the Bible?
I'm familiar with it. We have, but yeah, I need to. I'll have to do another thing.
Fascinating.
Well, because that's a really important resource for, I want to write eventually, kind of going in a new direction. As Karen mentioned, my most recent book was just a year ago called Street Scriptures. Want to learn a little bit about the history of hip hop and everything, but I connected with theological. But I really want to do something on the desert. So yeah, I would love to come back at some point. I could talk about, because it's such a rich symbol. But one of the things that I absolutely know I want to do, one of the key chapters will be about the autumn people. Literally means the desert people. I think that will be a crucial resource for thinking about the desert, but I of course want to connect it with the biblical church. By thinking about God through the symbol of the desert. It's really interesting history of the so-called desert fathers. They never used the language of desert in relation to God. So it wasn't until the medievals, Meister Eckhart called God the divine desert. It was like one of the first to call God the divine desert. For him, it meant that none of our, like the desert as a symbol of emptiness or absence or desolation, which is not true of the Sonoran desert. But it's, the typical, it's like synonymous with concept of the void. But for him, it meant that none of our concepts, ideas, and images are adequate to God. God is the divine person. Yeah. But the early fathers in Egypt and Syria, they never used, and people pointed out there's a good reason. It's like the desert is a dangerous, threatening. They knew the harshness of the desert. And is it who described those concepts to God? Like if you think about people dying, the desert seems in person. And so you could see, like, it was only the medievals in Germany with Meister Eckhart that have these different notions of the desert that, so anyway, I guess that's what I'm saying. I'm thinking about this concept of the desert.
In a somewhat simplistic way, it seems there's two mindsets in our society right now. One of them primarily focuses on, for an umbrella term, the social justice issues that we face.
Yeah.
The other one is more concerned about how do we pay for all of it? Any ideas on how we possibly can bridge that divide between these two mindsets?
It's kind of what I was like, not necessarily an issue of like, okay, fiscal responsibility. But I do think there are these extreme camps. And there's one camp that cares less about social justice or human rights, and the other camp that only cares about those issues. I guess what I'm saying is, like, true to the Christian tradition, if you consider yourself part of that tradition, it's to be deeply concerned about both. That is the kind of the gist of it. But yeah, it's like we exist in these different camps. I mean, I guess it's always been the case that Christians have often seen the biblical tradition differently, but it seems more stark than the need to like build bridges more desperate than ever. That if you're a reader of the Bible, like again, it's not, these are injunctions, these are commands to love the neighbor as oneself, to care for the widow, the orphan, the needy. They're not suggestions. Demands. But yeah, because there are these like very intense camps, and what's driven so much of my policy is like, and that's.
No, I think how Christianity is being portrayed by the religious right as being isolated, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, have they read much of
I
it?
know.
People are, seeing this room to run. I preached on that one time.
Yeah.
I was really upset with me. It's like,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
political kind of stuff. I just said, this is what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 25. And I thought, he was this. And I got this whole email that I had gotten. And we went back and forth, and I think we can do some
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah. Right.
He was saying I was anti.
It is. Yeah. Yeah, that is a major problem. Again, I even get it with my students of the perceptions of what Christianity is on both sides, like both conservatives and then some of them like